we're just talking about inflammation. Let's get into that a
Sure.
little bit more. So I mean, post-injury, I mean, you first have that metabolic cascade, and more we're finding that a lot of the persistence of symptoms are related to inflammation. I mean, there's been studies done on, for example, elevated CRP levels, which is just a kind of global inflammatory marker. Elevated CRP levels immediately after injury, correlating with prolonged and persistent symptoms, right? Now, that could be due to, let's say, brain inflammation, but it could be due to inflammation in general. If there's soft tissue injuries that correspond with that, that just means maybe it's a more traumatic event and things like that. But just inflammation in general, and I know I've been kind of reading a lot about this lately, and I think it's extremely interesting. And we've been putting people on kind of this anti-inflammatory diet at Complete Concussions for years now, kind of on your recommendation. Let's talk about inflammation and some things that you can do. Let's talk about the gut.
Sure.
Let's talk about the gut-brain axis. And
There's
all
there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot there. So let's start with, we started talking about that acute pathway, right? So there's that excitotoxicity pathway, but at the same time, almost immediately, there is the stimulation and recruitment of inflammation-producing cells in the brain. These cells are called the microglia. And these very specific immune cells, they hang out in the brain and they don't interact with the rest of the body. So that's the blood-brain barrier. And once these cells become activated, they start spitting out these inflammatory molecules, cytokines, chemokines. You can measure these. And what they do is that their main goal is to try to get that healing to happen. And it takes that 14 days for, a mild TBI to kind of have some of that resolution. But we're seeing that these microglia even become primed longer than that. So that's that window that is even longer than that. My symptoms are gone away, but I now have this vulnerability window. So I think a lot of that's inflammation. And that inflammation actually impacts the rest of the body. So you mentioned gut, and we'll talk about that. But I want to mention that a lot of the symptoms like brain fog, I tell my patients have brain fog, persistent brain fog. That's a huge issue when it comes to inflammation, specifically brain inflammation, and also the inflammation and its effect on the barrier between the body and the brain, so the blood-brain barrier. And that's a symptom of things like brain fog. Headaches can have some of this, can have an inflammatory aspect, especially cervicogenic headaches have an inflammatory aspect. And now it's starting to have an impact on the rest of the body. And this is what I'm really interested in, both of us, we've really been grooving on lately, is that we're looking at the effect of this inflammation and how immediately, 3 hours after injury, the gut lining becomes more permeable.
That's wild.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
And the question that always strikes me is why? Like, if you have a brain injury, my gut's not injured. But the body, again, always has the healing process in mind. And so the idea is that I just sustained an injury to my brain. The organism needs to tell itself to slow down. So what that does is that it allows more inflammatory molecules from the gut lining, microbiome, to slow us down. So there's that sickness behavior that starts happening. Like, I'm tired, I'm not feeling well. So we wouldn't just keep going. So it's almost like our own break.
Right.
And so now you have a feedback of more inflammation in the body that goes back up to the brain. And the idea of that inflammation is to slow us down, but also to promote that phagocytosis, so basically cleaning up of that inflammation and resolution of that inflammation.
So basically gut permeability is inflammatory.
Exactly, yeah.
And the mechanism following brain injury is to tell your gut to become more permeable.
That's right.
To promote inflammation.
That's right.
So there would be a healing reason for that, try and heal the injury, but also potentially to slow things down a bit.
To tell the organism, say, hey, you need to not do what you normally do, and you need to take a bit of a break here.
So
that happens 3 hours after injury, peaks at 72 hours, and is present for 7 days plus after.
And how do you stop that?
Well, I think, this is a very interesting question. So
But
let's
do you
say,
want to stop
yeah,
it? How
exactly,
about that? How about
exactly.
that?
I don't think we should stop it. I think that's like when you sustain an injury and the body goes through this process and we've reached that threshold where and it's probably shades of gray, but where you really have that sickness behavior that's happening, we should be listening to our bodies. And I know you've been preaching this for a long time about, even though your symptoms, brain symptoms have gone away, there is a bigger window that, I would say if you have a TBI and you've had those initial symptoms, it's 2 weeks before you're, and I don't know, research comes out plus or minus a couple days once in a while. But there's a case to be made for that. It takes at least that long to have biochemical, resolution. And so that inflammation, like you said, through the gut is one of those key mechanisms. And I don't know if I'd want to change that acutely. Now, one of the key considerations is when people flip over to the chronic persistent symptoms.
Right.
And I really think, and there isn't really evidence that we've shown this yet, but based on everything that we have so far, is that I think the Achilles heel from a health perspective that a person has going into the injury, and many people have gut dysfunction, many people have hormonal dysfunction, yep, me too, that is where the dysfunction really sits from a chronic perspective. So a lot of people have intestinal permeability issues to start, and now you have a much more exaggerated response and it doesn't resolve because there's an injury there happening.